A whisper from the past stirs in the shadows, a secret locked away, a truth tangled in deception and danger. Tonight, we unravel a mystery where nothing is as it seems, and every shadow hides a story waiting to be told. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was on a blustery April evening that the whole affair began. One of those London nights, when the wind carries the scent of wet stone and burnt coal through the open cracks of Baker Street. Holmes had taken to his violin, drawing from it a series of slow, brooding notes that seemed less like music and more like inquiry. He played not for pleasure that night, but as if searching for something just beyond reach. I watched him from my armchair, the newspaper idle in my lap, and noted that peculiar set of his brow, which always signalled the presence of some silent unrest within. The knock, when it came, was not timid. It was sharp, rapid, and imperious, the sort of knock that announces not a visitor, but an interruption. Holmes ceased playing at once, not with surprise, but with a sort of grim anticipation. He placed the bow gently on the windowsill and turned his head slightly. "That," he said dryly, "is not Lestrade, and it most certainly is not Mrs. Hudson." I had half risen to answer it when the door burst open with scarcely a pause. A woman stepped in as though she owned the air around her. Her cloak, damp and streaked with mud along the hem, billowed behind her like a theatre curtain. Her cheeks were flushed, her expression fierce, and her gloved hands trembled not with cold, but with purpose. She surveyed the room in one sweeping motion, and for a moment I fancied that Holmes was about to chastise her for the unannounced intrusion. Instead, he remained utterly still. Only the sharp glint in his grey eyes betrayed his attention. She smelled faintly of damp roses and something more estroit, jasmine perhaps, though aged and bitter on the wind. A single strand of dark embroidery traced the sleeve of her cloak. Foreign, Eastern in character. Her boots bore the clinging residue of carriage oil and countryside clay. Holmes said nothing. Neither, to my astonishment, did he rise. His gaze remained fixed upon her face with an intensity that hinted not at curiosity, but recognition. She, in turn, gave him no greeting. "I do not come to you for favours," she said at last, her voice carrying the subtle accent of the Adriatic and the unmistakable cadence of contempt. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Holmes. I require only your mind, not your conscience." The words struck the room with a peculiar weight. I blinked, expecting Holmes to bristle, or at least respond with that cutting wit of his. Instead, he merely inclined his head slightly, as if her terms were not unexpected. She continued, "There is a matter that concerns more than myself, but I shall speak only once, and only to you." She said no more, and the silence that followed was a thing with shape and shadow. I could feel the heat of the fire behind me, but the air between us had grown cold. Holmes regarded her with a look I had seen only once before, in the aftermath of the Irene Adler affair, when defeat had tasted almost like admiration. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, uncertain whether I was intruding or witnessing something I had no business seeing. Holmes finally spoke, not to her, but to me. "Watson, you may wish to take notes." She stood near the hearth, still cloaked, still composed, as Holmes regarded her with the faintest glint of some distant recognition. At length, she removed her gloves, revealing long, pale fingers with a slight tremble at the knuckle. "I am Countess Radmila Petrovich," she said. The name struck me with only the vaguest familiarity, but the effect upon Holmes was immediate, though no one but I, who knew him best, would have noted it. His brow flickered, not surprise, but confirmation, perhaps. He inclined his head slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a manner that was neither smile nor sneer. "Indeed," he said simply. I would not have come, the Countess continued, were it not for the manner of the intrusion. She described, in crisp, deliberate sentences, how someone had entered her Mayfair townhouse in the dead of night. Nothing had been taken, no drawers rifled, no trinkets displaced. But the intruder had known precisely where to go. A concealed alcove behind a library panel, long sealed. They disturbed the wood, she said, but left no mark beyond a smudge of ash. Her voice betrayed no fear, but something in it carried the steel of someone too familiar with danger. There were letters once, she said, hidden there long ago, personal letters written to me by a man now dead. She paused then, her gaze falling not upon Holmes, but upon the edge of the carpet, as if reliving the weight of each folded page. They were not scandalous in tone, but damaging in context. Should they fall into the wrong hands, they would be used not for shame, but for leverage. Holmes did not move. And you believe someone knows of them? I asked, foolishly perhaps. I believe, she said, her eyes lifting sharply, that someone already does. The Countess drew in a slow breath, as if bracing herself for the storm her words might conjure. The man who wrote them was a statesman, Balkan, high-ranking, and not without enemies. If the letters are discovered, they may tie his name to events he escaped only through misdirection. Those events involve Montenegro, Vienna, and... She hesitated, eyes narrowing at Holmes. Other parties who would prefer they remain buried. It was then that I noticed Holmes' fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had not interrupted once, yet I could feel the air tightening around us, thought swirling behind those grey eyes. Throughout her account, Holmes remained motionless save for the occasional blink. To any other observer, he might have seemed cold or indifferent, but I had seen that particular silence before. It was the same quiet he held while watching a chess match unfold 5 moves ahead. The Countess, undeterred by his lack of reaction, continued with the precision of someone who expected no sympathy. I do not ask for protection, she said flatly, only information. If someone is seeking these letters, I must know who sent them. Holmes responded not with words, but a subtle tilt of the head, like a conductor waiting for the next note. She gathered her gloves, turned without further word, and departed with the same fierce composure with which she had entered. A faint trace of her perfume, a cool, powdered jasmine, lingered behind like an echo of forgotten gardens. The door closed, not with a slam, but with that perfectly polite finality which speaks of noble breeding and endless wars of posture. I turned to Holmes, but he remained seated, his gaze still fixed on the door, long after it had ceased to move. The room, though quiet, seemed somehow altered. I did not yet understand why, but Holmes already did. After a moment's silence, I cleared my throat. You've met her before, I said, less as a question than a certainty. Holmes finally turned his head, and in his expression I read something that I could only call reluctant acknowledgement. Yes, he replied, once. In Dubrovnik, under circumstances most unfortunate and deeply instructive. He stood, crossed to the window, and drew the curtain aside as if to peer into the street. But I suspected he was not truly looking at anything in the present. She is not a woman to summon help lightly, nor one to forget insult. Holmes returned from the window, pausing by the chair where she had sat. She was wearing Montenegrin silk, he said softly, almost to himself, and the stitching on her sleeve had come loose, a very specific fault caused by contact with carved oak. He bent and retrieved a fine black thread from the armrest. The panel was not opened gently. She was there. He studied it a moment, then added, and her hand trembled, but not from cold. No, that is the tremor of someone who fears what they've set in motion. He looked at me then, and for once I saw not triumph in his eyes, but warning. It was scarcely noon the following day when Holmes and I found ourselves standing within the Countess's drawing room, an austere space draped in Balkan tapestries and silence. Holmes moved with deliberate quiet as he approached the library wall, his fingers brushing over the carved walnut panelling as one might read a page of Braille. I stood by, uncertain of what he sought, until he drew a thin blade from his walking stick and gently probed the inner lip of the panel. "Aha," he murmured, then dabbed a fingertip against a small patch near the edge. "Belladonna, very faint, but unmistakable." He raised his hand to his nose and inhaled. "An amateur's mistake. Belladonna is subtle, but its oil clings. It was applied to dull the senses of anyone prying too close. Quite a sophisticated deterrent for an alleged burglar, wouldn't you say?" He pressed inward, and the panel creaked open a hair. "Our intruder knew precisely where to look," Holmes added, his voice clipped. "They weren't searching, they were retrieving. The Countess's maid, a young woman named Elira, was summoned from the upper floor. She arrived stiff-backed and guarded, her apron spotless and hands folded in front of her as though expecting cross-examination. Holmes regarded her not unkindly, and with that disarming civility of his, asked if she had noticed anything unusual the night of the intrusion. "No, sir," she replied, her eyes fixed somewhere just beyond his shoulder. "No unusual sounds? Drafts where there should be none? Locks sticking or unlocked?" "Nothing, sir. Not even a whisper of unease from your mistress?" "She doesn't confide in me, sir." Holmes gave a soft smile. "And yet you worry." A twitch at the corner of her mouth was the only betrayal. "She has enemies, does she not?" Holmes asked gently. Elira hesitated, then lowered her voice. "In the old country, many, but here, I don't know." She added quickly, "That is not my place to say." Holmes inclined his head. "Quite right," he murmured, turning away. "It rarely is. But the truth has a habit of slipping through even locked doors." In contrast to the maid's restraint, the gardener proved voluble. A man of indeterminate age and stained knuckles, he met us by the back gate with a spade in hand and conspiracies in his eyes. "Oh, I told her ladyship," he declared before Holmes could even inquire, "that ever since the Austrian fellow took to watching from across the square, nothing good would come." "Austrian fellow?" I asked, arching a brow. "Tall chap, blonde, heavy coat, always seems to be waiting for someone who never arrives. Been 3 times last week, always in the fog." "And what precisely was he doing?" "Leaning on the rail like he owned the pavement. Smoked those thin foreign cigarettes. You know the sort." Holmes nodded. "And did you speak to him?" The gardener chuckled. "He didn't seem the chatty sort." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Sometimes, Mr. Durnley, it is the silent men who are shouting the loudest." We returned to Baker Street with the scent of damp roses still clinging faintly to Holmes' coat. He sat with his hands steepled before him, eyes closed, not in sleep, but calculation. "The letters," he said after a pause, "were not written by the Countess, but to her. This distinction matters greatly." "How can you be so sure?" I asked. "There is no shame in a woman receiving affection," Holmes replied. "But there is danger when such affection comes from a man of political consequence, particularly one whose correspondence may reveal more than sentiment." "And you believe he is dead?" Holmes opened one eye. "He is more than dead. He is politically extinct, cleansed from the record, and yet his letters live. That, my dear Watson, is what makes them valuable." I sat back, struck again by Holmes' ability to see not what was written, but what had once been intended. Later that evening, as Holmes smoked, and the rain began to patter against the window panes, I scoured my old files and clippings. In a Foreign Affairs supplement from 3 years prior, I found what we sought. Countess Petrovich, once esteemed at the Montenegrin court, exiled following charges of consorting with agents of foreign powers. The article hinted at espionage, but little was confirmed. What struck me most was a quote attributed to an unnamed diplomat. She played her part too well. No one knew which side she served, not even her own. I handed the paper to Holmes, who read it in silence. She was cast out, I said, and now she returns. Why? Holmes exhaled a long stream of smoke. Because the past, my dear Watson, is not content to remain buried, especially when someone begins digging. Holmes took little time to confirm the gardener's story. A message was sent, a contact summoned, and by the following dusk, we sat in the shadowed corner of a tobacconist's near Knightsbridge. That man, Holmes said, gesturing subtly, is Lucian von Fuchs, son of Baron Matthias von Fuchs of the Vienna delegation. His father was once an adversary of the Countess's patron. They have history. Von Fuchs stood beneath a gas lamp, seemingly waiting for someone, or perhaps simply watching for someone to emerge. He lit a cigarette with angular precision, the flame briefly illuminating sharp cheekbones and gloved hands. Holmes observed him through half-lidded eyes. "The son comes to finish the father's campaign," he murmured. "And if he suspects that those letters are here in London, then he will not act alone." "And what do we do?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "We give him something to chase." That evening, Holmes sat at his desk and penned a single note on aged parchment. The language was vague, the references subtle, but the implication was unmistakable. The letter suggested that certain documents of political and personal sensitivity had resurfaced in the hands of a third party, now known to reside in London. I watched him seal it with wax and dispatch it by messenger. "You're planting bait," I said. Holmes didn't look up. "Indeed. And what if he takes it?" Holmes finally met my eyes. "He already has. This letter merely tells him which door to knock on, and I have ensured that it is ours." I shivered slightly, though not from cold. Holmes leaned back, fingers tapping the armrest. "Sometimes, Watson, it is not the truth that draws men to action, but the illusion of it. Now let us see who takes the first step into shadow." It was late in the afternoon, the hour when London's grey seemed to lean hardest against the gas lamps, that Holmes and I took a walk through Kensington Gardens under the pretext of air and idle talk. In truth, I had grown uneasy since the Countess's departure, and Holmes, though characteristically silent, betrayed his thoughts by the slow deliberation of his stride and the rare furrow at his brow. "Someone's eyes are upon us," he murmured without breaking pace. I turned instinctively, but saw only a nursemaid with a pram and an old man feeding crumbs to a gathering of birds. "Don't look," Holmes chided softly. "He's behind the iron railings of that mews gate, pretending to admire the architecture of a dustbin." I followed Holmes' gaze discreetly and, after a moment, caught sight of a figure. Tall, well-dressed, too still for mere loitering. There was something in his posture that smacked more of scrutiny than sightseeing. A slight movement of the hand to adjust his glove, and I saw it. A glint of silver, metallic and deliberate, just beneath the cuff. Holmes nodded to himself, as though some private ledger had just balanced. As we walked on, Holmes spoke with the ease of a man discussing the weather, though I knew his mind was racing. "The cufflinks, Watson. Did you catch them?" "Barely. Silver, oval, with a falcon engraved. A very old crest, Balkan in origin and rather specific. The House of Fuchs. It was retired from court usage after an unfortunate scandal involving forged maps and a counterfeit bishop." "I'm afraid you've lost me," I admitted. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Lucian von Fuchs is the son of Baron Matthias von Fuchs, who served as attaché to Vienna's Balkan desk. His father spent 2 decades attempting to discredit the Montenegrine court, particularly those aligned with the Countess's late patron. So this fellow behind the railings, he's watching us? He's watching her, or so he believes. But when bait is dangled, it rarely chooses its watcher." I glanced again over my shoulder, but the man had vanished. Holmes patted my arm. "Let us not be disappointed. The best foxes hide in brambles before they spring. Ours has merely scented a path worth pursuing. The following day, Holmes's restlessness translated into something far more deliberate. "You will indulge me, Watson," he said, by taking a small detour to Camden and loitering near the tobacconists on Rathbone Street. "Buy something ghastly and remain visible." Visible to whom? To the man who thinks himself invisible. As I approached the appointed corner, Holmes had already vanished into the crowd. I did as instructed, purchased a most unpleasant blend of shag, then lingered outside while pretending to inspect my gloves. I had scarcely counted a dozen passing carriages when I noticed a figure stop near the lamppost across the street, then slowly begin to close the distance. Holmes reappeared precisely at the moment I was beginning to doubt the plan. He stepped directly into the path of the stranger and, with a swift motion, tapped his cane against the pavement. "You've dropped something," Holmes said, though the man had done no such thing. Startled, the stranger turned, and in the moment's hesitation, Holmes seized his sleeve and twisted it sharply. A cuff was revealed, silver flashing with the falcon crest. "I think," said Holmes dryly, "you and I require a word." The stranger struggled only briefly before recognizing the futility of resistance, at least the intellectual sort that Holmes wielded like a blade. Once seated in a nearby tea room and supplied with precisely 1 lump of sugar, Holmes' own prescription for moral softening, the man glared across the table with the look of one confronted by a ghost. "I know you," he spat. "And I know you," Holmes returned evenly. "Lionel Rookwood, once of the Evening Star, now of no particular address and even less particular ethics." Rookwood flushed. "You destroyed me." "I merely revealed the sources of your fabrications. Your own errors did the rest." He curled his lip. "You think you've won, but I've friends now, real ones, people who want the truth to come out." Holmes leaned forward. "And what truth would that be?" Rookwood hesitated. "That she has the letters, that you knew about the murder and did nothing, that you helped cover it up." I stiffened. Holmes' face remained unreadable. "You're wrong," Holmes said calmly, "but do go on." Rookwood leaned forward with the air of a man about to tip a glass just far enough to spill without breaking it. "There was a death, wasn't there?" he said. "Not a public one, not even an official one, but a man died, and it mattered, and you knew. You were there, Holmes." Holmes regarded him without blinking. "The letters don't merely hint at a scandal," Rookwood pressed. "They confirm one, a diplomatic killing, passed off as a disappearance, a name smothered under silence. But the Countess had his last words. Letters he wrote to her, warning of what he feared, and she gave them to you." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. Rookwood sneered. "Is it false?" "I said it was fascinating." "You suppressed it," the journalist hissed. "You, the supposed seeker of truth, the man who lectures the Yard on transparency. But you buried it because it didn't suit you, because the woman mattered more. The accusation hung between us, and I felt a slow chill settle in my spine. The notion that Holmes might have concealed something of such gravity, it defied the very architecture of my understanding. And yet, he did not deny it. Holmes rose and poured himself a second cup of tea. A motion so casual it seemed almost sacrilegious given the storm Rookwood had unleashed. He took a sip before replying. "You mistake silence for guilt, Mr. Rookwood. I find it is often more useful to let a man speak until he reveals what he truly knows." Rookwood's smile faltered. "So you're saying I've revealed too much?" Holmes shrugged. "Only that you have an imagination well suited to fiction, but as you've no doubt learned, fiction pays poorly, unless one has letters." He placed the cup back on the saucer with a faint clink. "Let me offer you a riddle. What does one do with a truth so dangerous it serves no court, no justice, and no confession?" Rookwood's hands twitched. "You bury it," Holmes continued, or you let it drift into myth. You allow it to become a whisper men chase and never catch. Beside him, I found myself staring. Holmes, is there truth in any of what he says? He did not answer. He only looked at me, and in that look was something I'd seen perhaps only once before. The shadow of regret behind the machinery of brilliance. When Rookwood finally departed, having been assured there were no letters to be seen, Holmes stood a long while by the fireplace, one hand pressed to the mantel as though listening to the walls. I dared not interrupt the silence until he spoke again. "She is not the hunted," he said at last. "She is the one laying traps." "You mean the Countess?" I asked. "She's moved every piece on the board. She invited the break-in, fed whispers into diplomatic ears, and brought Rookwood here, knowing precisely what he would do with the scent. She has used me not as protector, but as pawn. But to what end? To draw out a man far more dangerous than any burglar," Holmes said, "and far more connected to that supposed scandal than she let on. Lucien von Fuchs is not merely his father's son. He is the one who carried out the deed." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Then why not say so outright? Because truth rarely persuades a liar," Holmes said. "But suspicion makes men reckless." Holmes turned to me with that peculiar gleam in his eye, the one I had come to recognize as a signal of both clarity and danger. "We must betray someone, Watson. Betray. Simulate betrayal if you prefer. We must appear to confirm what they most fear, that the letters are real, and that we possess them. We must let it be known that the Countess has entrusted them to me. But if they don't exist, precisely, their absence is their greatest power. A ghost can terrify more than a man with a pistol." "And who shall be the audience of this performance?" I asked. Holmes gave a wry smile. "The same man who watched us from the mews. The same who tried to intercept a ghost. If we are fortunate, he will act rashly. And if we are not," Holmes reached for his violin, "then we learn which player has been hiding their hand, and perhaps, just perhaps, discover who among us has been playing the deepest game of all." The following day brought an uncharacteristic flurry of telegrams and appointments to Baker Street, and with it, an electricity I had not seen in Holmes since the height of the Milverton affair. He was focused to the point of stillness, his instructions to Mrs. Hudson clipped and specific, and his violin case, curiously, vanished from its usual place above the hearth. "Lucien von Fuchs has accepted the invitation," he remarked late that evening, almost absently, as though he were speaking not of a matter but of a rook moving into place on a chessboard. "He believes I have the letters, and that I may be persuaded to negotiate terms of their return. He will arrive at 6:30. The Countess will come shortly thereafter." "And what role do you require of me?" I asked. "You will wait behind the curtain, revolver in hand. You must not reveal yourself unless prompted. You will hear what is necessary, and if things go poorly, you will act." "Act how?" "As you always do, Watson, with loyal improvisation." He paused at the window, eyes flicking toward the street. "This is not a case of criminal law, my friend. It is a matter of reputations built on secrets and cemented by silence. And tonight we play judge, jury, and if needed, executioner of illusion." At the appointed hour, all was prepared, or so I believed. The parlour was dimmed, the decoy packet placed in plain sight atop Holmes' writing desk, and my hand sat firm upon the revolver hidden behind the drapery. But as the clock struck 6:30 precisely, I found myself glancing about in growing alarm. Holmes was not in the flat. He had vanished without a word. The knock came with the precision of a trained diplomat. I held my breath as Mrs. Hudson, coached in every syllable of her role, showed in Lucien von Fuchs. He entered with all the serenity of a man accustomed to danger but confident in his superiority. A moment later, the door opened again, this time to admit Holmes, or so I thought. It was not until the figure removed his gloves and doffed the greatcoat with an unfamiliar clumsiness that I realised the deception. It was Lestrade. Lestrade, in Holmes's suit, cravat, and manner, wearing a wig that passed muster in fog but not in firelight. "I understand," Lestrade said coolly, "that you've come for something not your own." Von Fuchs tilted his head. "I was told Mr. Holmes would be present." "He is," Lestrade replied, voice dry as paper. "Everywhere, in fact. Especially where men believe he is not." I could not help but admire the performance, even as my finger twitched upon the trigger. Just as Lestrade and Von Fuchs settled into their dance of diplomacy and accusation, a sudden commotion erupted in the street below. Shouts, the crackle of flame, and the unmistakable clanging of a fire brigade bell tore through the relative calm. Smoke billowed past the window panes. Lestrade rose instinctively, and Von Fuchs turned sharply toward the door. I remained behind the curtain, heart racing. Had it gone wrong? Was this an act of desperation, or part of Holmes's unseen orchestration? "Stay where you are," Lestrade barked, stepping between Von Fuchs and the exit. "That's across the street, not here. You're safer indoors." But Von Fuchs had already stepped toward the desk, not to flee. No, his gaze was fixed on the leather packet, as if it might combust on its own. "I see you've taken liberties with my hospitality," Lestrade said. Von Fuchs gave a tight-lipped smile. "I merely wish to confirm the legitimacy of what I've been summoned for." Outside, the shouting grew louder. I strained to hear, yet something in the rhythm struck me. It was too perfect, too well timed. Then I understood. The fire was no accident. It was cover. No sooner had I grasped Holmes' intent than I heard it. The whisper of the parlour door creaking behind me. A second intruder, silent and swift, moving through the smoky shadows. They did not go to Von Fuchs. They moved for the desk. I turned from behind the curtain, revolver raised, and stepped forward. The figure, a cloak shape with gloved hands, froze at the sight of me. "Don't," I warned. But the figure lunged forward anyway, snatching the packet and attempting to flee. I seized the wrist and pulled hard, sending the contents scattering. Lestrade pivoted in time to assist, and the cloak came away in our grasp, revealing not a man, but a woman, the maid from the Countess's house. "Elira!" I gasped. The woman's eyes flashed with fury. "You know nothing," she hissed, accent heavy now, unmasked. "I was told to retrieve what was hers." Lestrade cuffed her swiftly. Von Fuchs stood back, observing the scene with narrowed eyes, but said nothing. "Holmes," I muttered. "Where in God's name is Holmes?" A voice came from the stair behind us. "Right where he intended to be, Watson." The moment Holmes spoke from the stair, both Lestrade and I turned sharply toward the sound. He descended with leisurely poise, dressed plainly, yet exuding the same sharp energy he possessed when stalking truth, through alleys and salons alike. "I must commend you, Elira," he said pleasantly, as though greeting a neighbour at a tea room. "You nearly succeeded." The woman made no more, remained crouched, breath quick, her eyes darting between Holmes and the door. "You don't understand," she said. "I didn't come to steal. I came to stop what she couldn't stop herself." Holmes raised a brow. "Then allow me to guess. You are not merely a servant. You are her kin." Elira hesitated, then nodded once. "Her cousin. We were raised in Cetinge like sisters. She made me promise. If things ever reached England again, I was to intervene. She feared what she might do if left unchecked." "You were sent," Holmes said, "to recover something that does not exist." At that, her composure fractured. "You lie. I saw the panel. I saw the letters once, in her hands. You cannot tell me they're phantoms." "Ah," Holmes murmured, "but I can, and I will." Von Fuchs stepped forward then, his expression unreadable. "So," he said, "the Countess sends assassins in aprons now. Truly, the old court has fallen." Holmes turned slowly. "And yet here you are, von Fuchs, drawn to the same bait, dancing just as blindly." Holmes moved to the desk, collected the scattered papers, and with a flick of his wrist, tossed them into the empty hearth. They were ordinary pages, blank but for a few hastily scribbled lines. Nothing diplomatic, nothing incriminating, just shadows dressed in envelopes. "There were never any letters," Holmes said simply. Von Fuchs blinked. "Then what have we been chasing?" "An idea," Holmes replied. "A rumour fed carefully into the right circles, designed to inflame suspicion and awaken memory. A ghost of ink and scandal." Lestrade, frowning, muttered, "So this entire affair's been theatre?" "More precisely," Holmes said, "a baited stage. I merely provided the curtain and the footlights." Elira stood slowly, as though suddenly older. "She made me believe it. She said they could bring down an empire." Holmes nodded. "Because it was never about evidence. It was about consequence. The mere possibility of those letters was enough to drive Mr. von Fuchs across borders and bring a forgotten betrayal into the open." Von Fuchs narrowed his eyes. "And what of your role in all this? Why help her?" Holmes stared at the empty hearth. "Because once, in a ruined garden above the Bay of Kotor, I failed to prevent a murder. I owe someone a chance at truth, even if it is dressed in lies." As if conjured by cue, the Countess appeared in the doorway, unannounced yet unmistakable. No one moved. Even Lestrade, rarely struck silent, allowed her to cross the threshold without protest. Radmila's eyes swept the room. Holmes, Lestrade, von Fuchs, Elira. She did not smile. "So the curtain has fallen," she said quietly. Von Fuchs stepped forward. "You tried to ruin me." "I did," she answered without flinching. "As you ruined my father, my family, my name. You see, Lucien, you were not your father's heir in title only. The cruelty passed on as surely as the jawline." Von Fuchs opened his mouth, then shut it. He turned sharply and made for the door. No one stopped him. Radmila turned to Holmes. "You knew from the beginning." He inclined his head. "You are not a subtle player, Countess, merely a precise one." "I did not want protection," she said. "I wanted consequence. I wanted him to know someone remembered," Holmes replied, "and now he does." She looked at the remains of the decoy packet. "There were never letters." "No," Holmes said, "but you made the world believe otherwise. That is, in its own way, more powerful." Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing more. That evening, when all had departed and the embers once again whispered beneath the grate, I sat across from Holmes, uncertain of what to say. He stared into the coals, fingers steepled, the smoke from his pipe curling like a caged thought. "You knew what she wanted from the start," I said at last. "I suspected," he answered. "The rest revealed itself through silence. You let it play out." "Yes," I shook my head. "You allowed a falsehood to circulate. You let an innocent maid be arrested, a man driven across Europe, a fire staged, reputation risked, all for something that never existed." Holmes turned to me, and for once I saw not detachment in his eyes, but a quiet melancholy. "Truth, Watson, is not always about what happened. Sometimes it is about what must be believed in order for balance to return. What justice would a courtroom give for her father's betrayal? What remedy for a diplomatic crime buried beneath titles and medals? I offered her no verdict, only a stage. She did the rest." "And the real letters?" I asked. Holmes exhaled. "There were none. But had there been, I would not have kept them. We sat in silence. Holmes struck a final note on the violin, one so soft it barely echoed. Outside, Baker Street sighed under the weight of another evening. The case, as it were, had never been a case at all, but something older, something unfinished. Holmes had merely opened the window and let the past walk through. We sat amid the remnants of a deception so finely woven that even I, who had accompanied Holmes through 100 intrigues, found myself at a loss. The silence in our sitting room was punctuated only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional hiss of coal shifting in the grate. Holmes, stretched long and lean in his chair, tapped his fingers together with the air of a man who had just concluded a sonata he had long rehearsed. "You see, Watson," he began, "there is a curious elegance to a lie which holds no substance, yet bears weight enough to move men across oceans." I said nothing. I had learned that his revelations arrived best when left uninterrupted. "Lucien von Fuchs," Holmes continued, "was not drawn here by sentiment nor by guilt. He was drawn by fear, the fear that something he had done in youth had grown claws and would now drag him into daylight. And the letters?" I asked, already suspecting the answer, though hoping otherwise. "Never written, never read, never even conceived until Radmill realized the only way to provoke a reaction was to whisper of something dangerous enough to draw him from his marble halls in Vienna." He paused, then added, "There are times, my dear fellow, when the rumour of fire burns more keenly than the flame itself." There was a finality in his tone, not of fatigue, but of certainty. The performance was over. The audience had been fooled, and the magician had vanished behind the curtain. "The scandal," Holmes said, rising at last to refill his pipe, "was genuine, quite." I turned toward him, but I thought, if there were no letters. He looked at me with the faintest smile. "Ah, Watson, you mistake paper for proof. The scandal itself, a betrayal of diplomatic confidence in 1887, tied to a Montenegrin succession crisis, was very real. The details were whispered at the Carlton Club, suppressed in dispatches, and excised from Vienna's archives with surgical thoroughness. But the act itself, that remained. And Lucien was the instrument of that betrayal," Holmes replied, though never charged, never formally named. "Radmiller's father, General Kernovich, died under accusations of treason. His name was disgraced, his lands seized, his family driven into ruin, all engineered through a quiet note passed to a Prussian envoy, signed, though never proven, by the hand of Lucien's father, or perhaps Lucien himself." He paused to strike a match, and I watched the tip glow before vanishing into smoke. "She never needed the letters, Watson. What mattered was that he believed they might exist. That was the fulcrum. She whispered of them in Vienna, let Elira be seen carrying sealed envelopes at the embassies. Rumour did the rest. And you?" I amplified the myth, carefully, through channels that von Fuchs monitored. It was an orchestration, not of evidence, but of belief. He drew in the smoke and released it slowly. "You might say we built a bonfire entirely from shadows and watched as the guilty stepped into the light." Holmes seldom spoke of failures. When he did, it was not with bitterness, but with a curious detachment, as though describing the laws of gravity. It was the spring of 1811. He bustled, and I was in Ragusa, posing as a Greek bookseller with an interest in revolutionary pamphlets. Radmila was then only 17. Her father, General Kernovich, had just returned from Vienna, visibly shaken, though too proud to admit why. I was there at the behest of the Foreign Office, who had caught wind of an imminent assassination, a Black Hand faction within the Montenegrin army, plotting to eliminate royal loyalists before a German-backed treaty could be signed. I leaned forward, Holmes's eyes, for once, were not abstracted, but vividly present. I warned Kernovic. He dismissed me. That evening, during a garden fete, he was found slumped beside a fountain, dead from what appeared to be a stroke. No autopsy was performed. The doctor, a friend of Lucien's, saw to that. And you suspected murder? I knew it, Holmes said, with rare heat. But proof? None. And worse, the very man I suspected was feted in Vienna for having prevented a military uprising. He walked free, decorated. He closed his eyes for a moment. Radmila saw me at the funeral. She asked only one question. Why did you not stop them? I had no answer. He opened his eyes again. Sometimes, Watson, we do not solve cases. We carry them, like ashes tucked into the lining of an old coat. She played you, I said quietly. Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the chessboard by the window, where two bishops stood alone amidst the wreckage of the game he and I had abandoned days earlier. She played everyone, he said at last. But I allowed it, not from ignorance, but permission. I felt a frown crease my brow. Why? Because she sought not revenge, but revelation. She wanted him to face what he had buried, not in a court, but in a room, to see her, hear her voice, and understand what he had made of her life. She baited him with the promise of blackmail. No, Holmes said. She baited him with his own guilt. The myth of the letters was a reflection. It showed only what the viewer already feared. I sat back, the truth settling upon me like dust in a library left too long undisturbed. Was she dangerous? Utterly, Holmes replied, but not to the innocent. I gave a low whistle. You could have stopped her. I could have, Holmes agreed. But to what end? She had no weapon, no threat, only theatre, exquisitely timed and bloodless. Her justice was not mine to administer. He stood and moved to the window. I let the game unfold, Watson, because sometimes the best outcome is not the one written in law books, but the one that allows the dead to sleep a little more soundly. Outside, the fog curled around the lamplight. Inside, the echoes of old crimes and older griefs faded, one truth at a time. It is no small thing to admit that Sherlock Holmes, master of deductions and destroyer of deceptions, had met his match, not in intellect, but in method. And yet, as I look back on the events of that strange fortnight, I could not help but feel that Radmila Cernovic had played a game every bit as intricate as his. She had employed his own instruments, silence, suggestion, and misdirection, with a deftness that would have done Holmes credit. Her lies were never stated, only implied. Her threats, never spoken, only inferred. She had understood, perhaps better than any we had encountered, that the most dangerous weapons in such affairs are not daggers or pistols, but illusions carefully deployed and truths precisely withheld. She learned from you, I said aloud, more to myself than to Holmes, who was still staring out into the evening fog. Not from me, he replied without turning. From the world. I merely gave it a mirror. That, I think, was the highest compliment he could pay, and though I remained uneasy with the outcome, with justice doled not by court but by conscience, I could not deny a grudging admiration, for in Radmila I saw not merely a grieving daughter or a cunning noblewoman, but a mind that had learned to shape reality itself. She had not defeated Holmes, but she had stood alongside him on the board, a player, not a piece, and he had let her move first. Inspector Lestrade, who had been lurking at the edges of the case like a bad-tempered house cat, made his departure the following morning with all the grace of a man who had walked into a room expecting burglary and found a poetry recital instead. I dare say I've had my fill of foreign dramatics, he muttered, tugging his gloves on with unnecessary vigour. All this cloak and dagger shadow dancing nonsense. It's not how we do things at Scotland Yard. Holmes, seated with unnerving tranquillity, offered him no more than a mild, "No, indeed, you have procedures. We have art, Lestrade sniffed audibly. If you ask me, the whole thing's a blasted opera. I'd have had her in irons the moment she crossed the channel, which would have alerted Lucien, driven him deeper underground, and buried the past unexamined, Holmes replied coolly. But yes, you'd have had your arrest. Lestrade's moustache bristled. And what do we have instead, Mr. Holmes? A freed countess, a disappeared villain, and no evidence fit for court. Holmes rose and extended a hand. In other words, the truth, unspoiled by bureaucracy. Lestrade took the hand grudgingly, then stalked toward the door with one final remark. Give me a good East End pickpocket over these aristocratic games any day. As the door shut behind him, I turned to Holmes. You enjoy provoking him. He smiled faintly. Lestrade is the anvil. One must strike it from time to time, to see whether the metal still rings true. That evening, I found Holmes alone with his violin, the fire dwindling, the windows shadowed with rain, and a faint, unsettled hush lingering over Baker Street. He played not one of his usual caprices, but something mournful, unresolved, and curiously hesitant in its cadence. You're troubled, I said, though it was more observation than inquiry. Not troubled, Watson. Reflective. There is a difference. He set the bow down gently. There are occasions when facts serve little purpose, and a fiction, precisely crafted, achieves a purer result. That, I think, is the true art of deception. I thought you disapproved of lies. I disapprove of clumsy ones, he corrected. But a lie that heals, that reveals by concealing, that, my friend, is not dishonesty. It is design. There was a long pause. I once told you, he went on, that the world is full of obvious things which nobody ever observes. I might now add, it is full of true things which never occurred. Radmila's letters, the threat they posed, the guilt they summoned, all true and all imagined. He lifted the violin once more. Some notes, Watson, do not exist upon the page, and yet, when played correctly, they are the ones you remember. I said nothing. The melody returned, ghost-like and plaintive. The fire hissed low, the hour grew late, and I felt then, as I've only adequate felt, that truth itself can sometimes only be heard when no one is speaking. Even now, years removed from the case, I find myself uncertain. Not about what happened, for the facts are documented, the actions recorded, but about what meant to happen, and whether Holmes orchestrated events or merely allowed them to unravel in precisely the way he had foreseen. He never said. He never even hinted. Radmila returned to the continent under a different name. Lucien von Fuchs, so far as I know, was quietly discredited within the Viennese court, though no formal charge was ever brought. And Holmes, well, Holmes turned to a treatise on Egyptian ciphers the very next morning, as though he had not watched two lives collide like chess kings in a drawn match. What puzzles me most is this. Did Holmes plan to let Radmila run her charade? Or did he, in some uncharacteristic surrender to sentiment, simply choose not to stop her? At times, I think he saw her as a kindred spirit, not a criminal, but a ghost chaser like himself, a woman grasping at shapes, half lost to history, trying to right what had already gone wrong. But perhaps, and here lies my deepest uncertainty, perhaps Holmes never cared whether the letters existed or not. Perhaps he understood from the beginning that the case was not about paper and ink, but about grief, justice, and the illusions we conjure to survive both. In the end, I cannot say whether we uncovered the truth or merely unwrapped a more beautiful lie, but Holmes smiled, and that, for me, was always the final clue. The day had waned into a quiet evening at 221B Baker Street, and a strange stillness had settled upon our rooms. Holmes sat alone, a solitary figure in the corner, his profile half swallowed by shadows cast from the fire's uneven flicker. The embers glowed faintly, their restless dance a mirror to the thoughts that seemed to stir within him. I watched him, wondering if his mind was still chasing the phantom threads of the case or retreating to safer realms of violin melodies and chemical experiments. There was a heaviness about him, unusual for one so accustomed to the sharp joys of intellectual conquest. The usual sparkle of triumph was absent, replaced by a distant gaze that spoke of memories too persistent to be silenced, yet too painful to be spoken aloud. The question had long hovered unspoken between us, but at last I summoned the courage to break the silence. "Holmes," I ventured gently, "did you regret it? Helping the Countess, allowing her to weave such a web, a deception so deft and dangerous? Did you ever question whether your silence served justice or merely obscured it?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes fixed on the fire, as though searching for something in the smoke that the rest of us could not see. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying that hint of irony he often employed to mask deeper thoughts. "Regret," he began, "is a luxury for those who believe the past can be altered. I have come to think that some truths are like melodies, better left unheard than poorly performed." He paused, the words hanging like smoke in the air between us. "To reveal certain truths," he continued, "is to invite discord where harmony might better serve. The Countess's game was not one of mere truth or falsehood, but of consequence. In this world, Watson, some lies are more useful than facts, and some silences more potent than declarations." I listened, fascinated, yet unsettled. Holmes's detachment remained, but beneath it flickered a rare glimmer of understanding, an acknowledgement that human affairs, even when dissected by logic, often defy neat resolution. Our conversation was interrupted by a gentle, unexpected knock at the door. I rose, the quiet sound reverberating through the stillness as if heralding more than a visitor. Holmes, still seated, did not look up but murmured softly, "This next one, Watson, I hope, comes without ghosts." A chill crept over me as I opened the door, the lingering echo of that cryptic phrase hanging between the fading embers and the encroaching night. It seemed the past, with its shadows and secrets, was not yet done with us, and I knew, without asking, that whatever awaited beyond that threshold would call once more upon the skills and silence of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes settled back into his chair, fingers steepled, eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of intellect. "Watson," he said quietly, "this case reminds us that truth is often a fragile thing, shaped as much by belief as by fact. Sometimes the shadows we chase reveal more about ourselves than about the world we inhabit." He paused, then added with a wry smile, "And the greatest deception lies not in what is hidden, but in what we choose to see." "Now, I leave you with this," Holmes continued. "What do you suppose was the criminal's gravest miscalculation? Was it underestimating the power of illusion, or trusting in shadows to mask the past? If this story intrigued you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of deduction and mystery, and share this adventure with fellow seekers of the truth. Until next time, keep your eyes sharp and your mind sharper.